Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Metacast episode 2 on strategy. My name is Yashis, and this is.
I'm Ajay from Team 14481 Don't Blink, and welcome back to today's episode of Metacast. Today we are joined by two former FTC alumni, Nick from the University of Florida and Shawn from the University of Maryland.
Today, we are going to be going over the strategies and ideas teams might want to use during their season and during matches this year. As always, today's episode of Metacast is sponsored by VRTX. Please visit printvrtx.com for more information on how you can get all your 3D printed manufacturing goods 3D printed, and use code METAVRTX15 for 15% off your order. What's up, Nick and Shawn? How are you doing today?
We're doing great.
Great. We're going to be talking about strategies of the new FTC game, Centerstage, today. So, to start off, I have a few questions for you. So, what do you guys think the key objectives of the Centerstage game is? And how do you think the teams are going to prioritize them in their strategies and how they communicate with their alliance partners during the game?
All right, so my name is Nick, and for me, I think the things that kind of stuck out to me about this game was that outside of the very basic scoring objectives, which are just putting pixels onto the backdrop, the main things you're gonna have to consider to be a really effective partner and teammate is going to be how quickly you can cycle them, which is the most obvious answer. But beyond that, there's a lot of points to be gained in the autonomous period and how you are cycling those pixels off of the stack. Because they are double counted. So that is the first thing you kind of want to focus on. That's kind of outside of the box. The second thing would be reliably getting mosaics. It's kind of a lot harder than I thought when I first actually watched some of the videos of this game to actually get these mosaics. But that is going to be what is going to determine a winning robot versus a losing one.
And kind of going off what Nick said, of course, autonomous is very important, but we could see some important strategies coming during teleop. Something that we saw in Skystone a lot is that we had one robot, putting blocks to the other robot that would then, take in these pixels or blocks and then output them. So we could see a strategy like that with one robot purely only just moving the pixels from the station to the robot that then will score. So we could see that system come into play with a scoring robot and a support robot. And that could be a priority teams choose if they believe that they can make the most optimal scoring robot.
Yeah, that's all really interesting, and I definitely agree. The concept of the Skystone feeder bot and deposit bot is really interesting as well.
Yeah, just like to discuss more and elaborate on some of the points you guys made, like talking about mosaics, have you guys thought of like how like teams are going to be using that in teleop and autonomous this season? Because like definitely this is a very like every season we see like first coming out with games that are very much like autonomous. Like you get more points during the autonomous period, and so like do you think it's like is like a good strat to like go for like mosaics in like the autonomous period or like in teleop, and like how like teams should like go for that and work with their like alliance partner.
Yeah, well, considering the fact that in autonomous you're only going to be able to place one colored pixel realistically on the backboard, and then after that the rest of them are going to be white pixels. Something you could consider would be the pixels that you're placing that are all going to be white. You can kind of orient them in such a way that you're still able to design mosaics around the one color pixel that you're putting down.
And kind of going off that, um, of course, again, something we saw in power play was, was circuits, and the the circuit was never, like, I guess, the biggest priority. It was always something that you would do last second. So maybe what teams would prioritize is, just getting pixels on the board, and then if they see the opportunity for a mosaic to take advantage of that, to give them those little points. Because I think we saw during power play when teams tended to prioritize strictly getting the circuit, that they would get out coverage, and they would ultimately lose in the end game. So I think teams have to be very cautious about what they do with the mosaic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, especially from last year, we can understand that just going for the circuit last year, teams weren't really getting as many points as they could. So, this year, the goal shouldn't be to get the mosaics, it should be to score pixels. But if there's the opportunity for a mosaic, you can get it. And this conversation is kind of leading me into my next question, which is about the whole alliance scenario. Obviously, we talked about feeder bots and deposit box, but how do you guys think the alliances are going to communicate whereas to what pixels they want, what color they need, and how they're going to score the pixels to get the mosaics or the set lines?
So I think in this game, like you can't. The driver coach is important for, I guess, the cross team communication because I feel like that's much more important than the inter team communication. I don't really need to tell what my person is doing because what his job is relatively simple. He needs to just get the pixel and put it on the scoreboard. So what I think driver coach's priorities should be is communicating between the teams to come up with some sort of strategy during the game. And as you mentioned, with like a push, like a feeder bot and a scoring robot, in a situation like that where some of the teams that are have a very high scoring potential are put with a push bot or a robot that might do, maybe their slides are broken. That is a very valuable strategy that a team can try to utilize in order to compensate for that problem. Because in center stage and almost like in power play, where having a not the best teammate was a very that was a very detrimental thing. So teams kind of have to find a way around it and to also maybe optimize themselves for that situation because it's not until states or worlds where you can be fairly confident in your teammates. So that's what I think about the teammate situation and the communications that teams have to have during a competition during a match.
Yeah, and to kind of add on to that, to add another layer to it, I think the human player is also someone who has to be very knowledgeable about the game because they have to recognize from their side of the field not only what your team needs for their pixels for their mosaics, but also what your alliance partner is going to require. And then that communication is going to be very challenging because you're obviously going across the field. So one way to indicate that we were considering is having LEDs displayed on your robot in the color that you wanted, and figuring out some way to kind of package that into your robot design.
Yeah, that's like really cool that you said that. Like I recall in like Freight Frenzy that like I saw a lot of robots using like using lights on their robots for like color coordination in some sort of way. So one like question I'm trying to go into next to is what defensive strategies are effective in center stage and how can teams defend against scoring by their opponents?
So, defense in FTC is a very interesting topic, and it's something that I've always really wanted to do, but have never actually been able to just because of how the culture and the ruling system is determined in FTC. I would say the opportunities for it in this game are probably larger than most games because there are, I would say, fair amount of choke points, being the zones in which you have to cross over. So if you were a bot that was intent on playing defense, what you could do is have some form of extension mechanism, and then you could sit in a certain alliance's, I forgot what they're called, but the crossing zones, and you could cover both of them. So let's say, for example, a robot does not have functionality to get under the center bars, then that would really limit their driving potential.
And continuing off that, something that I would implore teams to do if they think they want to play defense is to talk to the ref, to talk during introduction. You have to be communicative with the ref and be communicative with the whole state ruling whatever, to kind of figure out like, oh, refs like this, refs are fine with this compared to refs don't like this, refs will give you a penalty for this. So just being aware and watching matches is very important, and also experimenting a little bit. If you're in a league meet or in a qualifier where you've already qualified for states, experimenting with defense, trying to I guess probe what the refs like and dislike, what the refs will allow and not allow, will give more information to teams and will give you a better understanding of what you can do for defense.
Yeah, defense is a big part of FTC every year, and this is really helpful for some teams that are trying to go for a six-wheel drive or maybe even a butterfly drivetrain to try and play some more defense, especially for teams that also want to do an extendo so that they don't have to deal with the other robots. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is scouting. So, how do you think teams are going to scout this year with the complicated basis of like trying to figure out which robot scored more pixels or which robot scored where, etc.?
So coming, being the head of scouting for 6417 last year, um, there's many different ways to scout, and we're starting to see teams look more towards a data-driven scouting, report, whether it be from autonomous points scored, from teleop points, looking at FTC Scout, looking at FTC stats, and we're starting to see predict FTC come out more with more and more accuracy on winning winning percentage and stuff like that. However, in your qualifiers and potentially in states, I think, looking at the robot and truly understanding like, okay, this team is having a problem with this, okay? And despite them having a good robot, like we see many times of teams performing poorly during qualifiers and making it up during playoffs. We can look at, cookie bots during worlds. We can look at so many teams and states and worlds, performing extremely well in playoffs despite doing poorly in qualifier. So I think that something that's really important a team should do is, of course, talking to other teams and trying to filter out, like, this team might perform, has a very high scoring potential, but their slides are broken. Maybe maybe if they fix that problem, we should pick them. So I think, keeping in mind the data and using that as a supplement for, instead of trying to figure out how many points a team has scored watching their match, using the data, but still going up to teams and watching matches and really understanding what teams robot are.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's definitely helpful to have that data where you have people in the stands watching the teams, but you should also be keeping in mind of what teams have different issues that are going on in the game, whether they're playing against a really good alliance or if their slides are just broken, which definitely makes sense. And do you think the people who are scouting should be taking notes on specifics that happen in the game, such as like this team might be worse at doing the hang, or this team's robot was broken, which is why they got less points?
Yeah, so when it comes down to scouting in that sense, it's almost, in my experience, more important to try and gauge the driver's skill level and understand how well they're going to handle the pressure. Because a lot of times, you can get someone that's comfortable in a easy match to win and they're able to score a lot, but when it gets down to a high pressure situation, it can kind of break down. So I think trying to evaluate past the point scored and saying that this team's able to get a climb or this team's able to consistently drive even when they come up against defense is something that should play like a huge factor in alliance partner decision making.
Yeah, so one thing I did want to talk about further a bit more is like what Sean was talking about, how like recently a lot of scouting has been become like very data driven. And so I really was like wondering like, I was like at last MPI, I was talking to someone from Wolfpack Machina, and he had developed like a really cool software for scouting where like it would look at like a lot of the matches, and it would like help them like find their like best like alliance selection picks. And like obviously, it definitely worked out for them like pretty well because they did end up winning MTI. And so like I really just wanted to know like other than obviously you guys were talking about how Sean was talking about data, it's obviously also like important to look at like what beneficial like the alliance will like that team will add, like how like what like that team would add to your alliance.
Yeah,
It's like I remember like even like just on data wise, like I could like name a lot of teams that would not be a good pick for your elimination matches when like it came to line selection. They were picked because a team had a strategy in mind or like
absolutely. Yeah.
something else in mind. So
So
like I was just wondering about.
yeah, my response to that would be if people followed that model, I don't believe Don't Blink would have been picked. And I think it's fair to say that Don't Blink was the most impactful robot out of any single robot in the entire world last year at the world's level, because there are things that have so much more effect than purely based off of your scores or whatever. And we know there's so much luck involved in FTC and the qualification matches, especially now that we're still on a win loss tie system. You're not in a position as a team where you can really carry yourself out of most matches, and you ultimately can't control whether you win or not, and you may get destroyed in the rankings because of that. So I think there's 100% of room for systems like the one that Wolfpack Machina has developed, and using data in that sense. But and in currently, I would say like you must also consider like a human impact on how well you think they're going to drive, how well they can handle it, and how well they fit into your alliance.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The human side is definitely something that needs to be considered this year. And then another question. So the end game phase has pretty much two main scoring tasks: the hang and then the drone launch. Which one do you guys think should be the higher priority for teams to perform during the end game if they can only select one?
I think the one that teams should pick is Hang. I think Hang is way more consistent to get down, and it's also not that, inconvenient of a mechanism to put on a robot. I think airplane, like the drone launch, it's a little weird to put on a robot. It doesn't have like thinking about what a center stage robot would look like. It would be a little come up with a place to put the drone launch. And it's also fairly inconsistent. You can't always make sure you get the zone one. So I think hang is what teams should prioritize, especially if you're running on a low budget or you're running out of time, because it's something you know for sure you can get down consistent and you can always score those points instead of being sometimes we can get zone one, but sometimes we just miss. So I think teams should really prioritize hang over drone lock.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks towards the thought process of just being consistent over all else. Because at the end of the day, you can have a really high ceiling, but if you're not consistently reaching near that ceiling, you're not going to look attractive to teams, and you're not going to be reliable enough as a partner to pick for alliances. I would also say, though, just to add on to that, there's probably no reason you can't have people on your team working towards a paper airplane launcher, and hopefully combine that onto a robot for the later league meets. So I don't think it's something you should avoid, but I think absolutely the climb is something you can 100% get down, and be confident and consistent with it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that insight. The hang is definitely what looks to be the sweeter option for teams if they only have the time to budget for one mechanism, especially if their league meet is next week. And yeah, my last question to you is: what do you guys think is going to be the dividing gap between a good team and a bad team in this year's game? What?
Uh, the thing that's going to be the dividing factor between a good team and a bad team. Did you say good team and bad team?
Yeah,
The deciding factor is whether you can cycle or not. This game is all about cycles. If you can't do cycles, you're just not going to be a good team. Your autonomous is going to be very important, and you being able to cycle is very important. And if you can't do either of those, or if you actually can't do both of them, then that's what separates a good team to a bad team.
Absolutely, and I've kind of been telling a lot of teams this, but you really, if you look at the points, in my view, the stack is so important in those teleop cycles, or excuse me, in the autonomous and teleop cycles. So you really want to like have a idea, a concept of how you're going to go after that, pretty much above all else, and that'll be a large separator between teams.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of points to be had with those stacks. There's around 15 on your side during the autonomous period, and if you can get all of them on, or at least half of them onto the backboard during autonomous, you'll get points for 15 pixels at the end of the game because of the double feature. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Nick and John and Sean, for joining us today.
Yeah, it was no problem. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely, thank you for having us, guys.
Have a great day.